What if I told you that the greatest empire the world had ever known didn't begin with armies marching in unison or vast cities under gleaming shields? What if I told you that it started not with certainty, but with a tumult of myths, power struggles, and betrayal so profound that it would send ripples through history that are still felt today? Rome's story is one of transformation of a republic born from revolution, only to be consumed by its own thirst for power. The empire that would one day rule over 3 continents, its armies would march across the sands of Africa, the hills of Europe, and the deserts of Asia, was not always meant to be an empire at all. It began as a city-state, a handful of villagers bound together by survival, and yet, through ambition, bloodshed, and betrayal, Rome would rise to dominate the known world. But how did this shift happen? What was it that turned a system built on shared power into one ruled by a single man? It all started with 2 brothers. The founding of Rome is wrapped in myth, as many great stories are, but underneath these tales lie truths that would change the course of history. Romulus and Remus, twin sons of the Vestal Virgin Rhea Silvia and the god Mars, were destined to be the fathers of an empire. Yet their lives would begin with a death sentence, a cruel order from a jealous king to cast them into the river. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. The Tiber River, knowing the importance of their destiny, cradled them and carried them gently to shore. There, they were discovered and nursed by a she-wolf, a symbol of both survival and the wild, untamed power of Rome itself. This story, this beginning of Rome, was not just about divine intervention, but about the very forces that would shape Rome's future survival against all odds, and the dangerous, intoxicating mix of power, loyalty, and betrayal. As the brothers grew, their ambition was fueled by the knowledge of their royal blood. But even before the city was founded, there was bloodshed. Romulus, in an act that would reverberate through Roman history, killed his brother Remus. It was a brutal moment, a brother slaying brother for the sake of power. This act of fratricide was the first of many such conflicts that would define the Roman Empire. It was a city born from violence and cemented in betrayal. Standing atop the Palatine Hill, Romulus, now the sole founder, marked the boundaries of his new city with a plough, a symbol of both cultivation and conquest. And with that act, in the year 753 BC, a new chapter in human history was written. Rome was born not from the wisdom of kings or the ideals of philosophers, but from bloodshed, sacrifice, and ambition. Yet, Rome's first problem, one that would continue to plague the Republic and later the Empire, was the shortage of women. Romulus, understanding the necessity of expanding his population, invited the neighbouring Sabines to a festival, only to abduct their daughters, forcing them to become wives for his men. This event, known as the Rape of the Sabine Women, is as controversial as it is pivotal. It marked the beginning of Rome's complex relationship with its neighbours, one built not on diplomacy, but on power and the will to take what was necessary to survive. But this was only the beginning of Rome's wild rise. For nearly 250 years after Romulus's death, Rome was governed by kings. 7 kings in total would rule over this fledgling city, each one shaping it in ways that would lay the foundation for the empire to come. The second king, Numa Pompilius, was remembered as wise and pious, creating many of Rome's religious traditions and institutions. Numa was a king of peace, but his successors, Tullus Hostilius and Ancus Marcius, were men of war expanding Rome's territory through conquest. Tullus Hostilius's defeat of Alba Longa, the city that had once been Rome's rival, marked the first of many military victories that would come to define the city's expansion. With each victory, Rome's power grew, absorbing the conquered people and bringing them into the fold. By the time Ancus Marcius built the first bridge across the Tiber, Rome was no longer a small village. It was becoming a regional power. It was during the reign of the 5th king, Tarquinius Priscus, that the influence of the Etruscans began to be felt in Rome. He began the construction of the Grand Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill and the Circus Maximus for chariot races, symbols of Rome's growing grandeur. But even as the city expanded, its internal struggles never ceased. The Romans, for all their ambition, could never escape the power struggles that came with such rapid growth. And then there was Servius Tullius, the sixth king. His reforms, the first constitution of Rome, organized citizens by wealth and military capability, creating a new structure that would endure for centuries. It was a social and military system designed to maintain order within a society growing more complex by the day. But it was the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, who would be Rome's undoing. His cruelty and arrogance led to his downfall, and when his son, Sextus Tarquinius, raped the noblewoman Lucretia, it ignited a rebellion. This rebellion was not just a revolt against an unjust king, it was the birth of the Roman Republic. And with that, the monarchy was overthrown, and the Romans vowed never again to be ruled by a king. But they would learn, as all great empires do, that the pursuit of power is never a straight path. The new republic, formed in the ashes of the old monarchy, would face its own struggles, a republic that would eventually turn into an empire. As Rome moved away from kings and into the republican experiment, the world watched. Would Rome be able to govern itself without falling into chaos? Or would the ambition of its leaders like Romulus destroy it from within? If you're fascinated by this transformation from a monarchy to an empire, make sure to hit that subscribe button and don't forget to like and share the video. Your support helps keep this channel going, and we have so many more exciting stories to tell you about the rise and fall of the greatest empire the world has ever known. But as we dig deeper into Rome's rise, we must ask, was it fate that allowed Romulus to survive the harshest of trials, or was it the beginning of something darker, something more treacherous that would define Rome's soul? The founding of Rome was not just about two twins raised by a she-wolf or divine intervention. It was about the struggle for power, the cunning ability to turn misfortune into opportunity. The gods had placed the twins on an impossible path, abandoned by their mother, cast aside by a king afraid of their potential. But Rome's destiny was written in the struggle, in the bloodshed of survival, and ultimately in the choices they made when the world seemed to reject them. The violence that was to come was not an anomaly in Rome's story. It was, in fact, the very fabric of its character. Rome was born from betrayal, as Romulus killed his brother Remus in cold blood. The act was swift and unforgiving, symbolic of the city's future where betrayal, violence, and ambition would become the fuel to drive it forward. Yet, paradoxically, this brutality gave birth to an empire whose vision stretched across the globe, built on a foundation of strength, dominance, and sheer will. But let's pause for a moment and ask ourselves, what was the true price of such ambition? The answer lies in Rome's rapid expansion. Within a few decades of Romulus's death, Rome had already begun its expansion beyond the Seven Hills. The borders of the small city-state stretched wider and wider as war became the catalyst for its growth. Rome was not a peaceful state. It was an empire that thrived on conquest, assimilation, and strategic diplomacy. The city was a melting pot of cultures and peoples, each one bound by their connection to Rome, but also marked by its insatiable hunger for power. This thirst for growth reached a critical point as Rome faced its first real challenge population. Romulus's city, though thriving, lacked one essential ingredient for its survival: women. It's a detail that might seem trivial at first, but it's actually one of the most important turning points in Rome's creation story. In a moment that remains one of the most controversial in Roman history, Romulus devised a plan that would forever define the city's relationship with its neighbours: the rape of the Sabine women. It was a calculated act of violence masked by the cloak of necessity. Romulus invited the Sabines, his neighbours, into Rome under the guise of friendship, offering them a grand festival. And then, in a bold and cruel move, he and his men abducted the Sabine women, forcing them into marriage, in an attempt to bolster Rome's population and secure the city's future. This brutal act of conquest would go on to create one of the most enduring paradoxes of Roman identity. The city was born from violence, and that violence would become part of its cultural DNA. The Sabine women, initially victims of the abduction, would later become the wives and mothers of Rome's future citizens, establishing the deep and contradictory roots of Roman society, born from brutality, yet capable of unity and strength. As the city grew and evolved, so did the men who ruled it. Rome's transition from monarchy to republic wasn't a simple shift. It was a dramatic struggle that saw power slip from one hand to another, each ruler leaving a mark on the city, shaping its future with every decision, every battle. The early kings of Rome were not mere figurehead rulers. They were visionaries, conquerors, and reformers. They built the very foundations of Rome's political, military, and cultural systems. And yet, their rule came at a cost. The monarchy, with all its strength and glory, could not sustain itself. The very power that allowed kings to build the city was the same force that would destroy it from within. The key to this demise lay in the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, a ruler whose cruelty would ignite the flames of rebellion. Tarquinius Superbus was a tyrant, a king whose arrogance and brutality were so overwhelming that they pushed the city to the brink. His reign was marked by the oppression of the Roman people and the blatant abuse of power. But it was the crime of his son, Sextus Tarquinius, that would become the catalyst for the end of the monarchy. The rape of the noblewoman Lucretia by Sextus, a crime that shook Rome to its core, would ignite a rebellion that would tear the monarchy apart. Lucretia, a woman of honor and virtue, took her own life in the aftermath of the assault, and her death became a rallying cry for the people of Rome. The nobleman, incensed by the injustice, rose up against Tarquinius Superbus, overthrowing him and his family. The monarchy was no more, but the question remained: what came next? The Romans had just cast off the yoke of monarchy, but were they prepared for the complex experiment that would follow? Would the republic, the system of government that they would create, be able to withstand the very forces that had led to the collapse of the monarchy? The birth of the Roman Republic was not a moment of celebration. It was a time of uncertainty, of doubt, and fear. The Republic was meant to be a system where power was shared, a system that would prevent any single man from rising to the level of a tyrant. But the same ambition that had brought Rome to power, that had driven Romulus to kill his brother, would never truly disappear. The roots of violence and betrayal remained, even in the Republic. In the wake of the monarchy's fall, Rome's leaders had to navigate a new and dangerous reality. Would they be able to govern themselves without slipping back into the chaos that had led to the end of the kings? Would the ambition of the Roman people, the same ambition that had seen them conquer and expand, prove to be their undoing? Or would they find a way to make this new system of shared power work? Rome's story is a tale of transformation, but it is also a tale of struggle, of overcoming impossible odds, of defying fate and forging a destiny through sheer force of will. It is a city born from blood and betrayal, yet capable of creating a system of government that would influence the world for centuries. As we look back on this monumental shift, we are left with questions that remain unanswered. Could the Republic have survived if not for the immense ambition of its leaders? Could Rome have remained a city-state? Or was its destiny always to become an empire? The answers to these questions would shape the course of history, and in a way, they are still being asked today. If you find yourself captivated by Rome's rise from monarchy to republic, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned for more videos as we dive deeper into the power struggles, the betrayals, and the dramatic transformations that turned a city-state into the greatest empire the world has ever known. The transformation of Rome from a small village on the banks of the Tiber River to an empire that would dominate vast swathes of the known world is nothing short of extraordinary. The transition from monarchy to republic was only the first step in the creation of a global power. As the dust settled from the overthrow of the last king, Rome found itself standing on the precipice of something far greater than anyone had imagined. But how did a city that had once been a small group of villagers become a colossal force, an empire that would eventually stretch across 3 continents? The answer lies in the vision and willpower of Rome's leaders, who, despite being bound by the Republic's democratic ideals, understood that power must always be expanded or lost. The first great steps toward Roman imperialism began with the determination to not simply survive, but to dominate. And to do that, Rome would need to grow not just in size, but in influence, military strength, and political savvy. The transformation began in the most unlikely of ways. Rome, even as it embraced republicanism, was still a relatively small and isolated city-state, surrounded by far stronger and more populous rivals. To the north, The Etruscans were a powerful civilization that dominated much of central Italy. To the south, the Greek colonies were wealthy and established, their culture and military might something to be reckoned with. But it wasn't just military strength that would make Rome a force, it was Rome's incredible adaptability and political ingenuity. The second king of Rome, Numa Pompilius, had set the foundations for the city's political and religious systems. But it was the third king, Tullus Hostilius, who would mark the beginning of Rome's military expansion. Unlike Numa, who was a man of peace and religion, Tullus Hostilius was a man of war. He understood that Rome's destiny could not be fulfilled by treaties and prayer alone. Conquest was necessary to secure Rome's future. Under his rule, Rome's first military conquest occurred. It wasn't just a battle for territory, it was a war for survival. Rome's victory over the neighbouring city of Alba Longa in the Battle of the Horatii and Curiatii was a landmark event that would set the tone for Rome's future. It was a conflict that demanded sacrifice, but it was also one that united the Roman people like never before. The battle wasn't just a victory, it was a turning point that solidified Rome's belief in its own power. As the city absorbed the Albans into the fold, the Romans realized the power of assimilation. Conquered peoples were not destroyed, they were integrated. The ability to bring other cultures into the Roman system would prove to be one of Rome's greatest strengths, allowing it to expand without diluting its own core identity. But it wasn't just through military conquest that Rome would grow, it was through strategic alliances, expansionist policies, and most crucially, the brilliance of its early leaders. Rome was uniquely positioned geographically, at the crossroads of trade between the north and south of Italy, and eventually between Europe and the Mediterranean. Its armies were small compared to those of its rivals, but they were disciplined, organized, and above all, led by men who understood the importance of unity and loyalty. As Rome expanded, it began to rely more heavily on the strength of its military. The legendary Roman legions became the backbone of the empire, capable of defeating enemies much larger and more established. These legions were not just a force of warriors, they were a symbol of Roman might. Discipline, endurance, and loyalty to Rome were the foundations of every soldier's training. The Roman military was a finely tuned machine, capable of overwhelming its enemies, not just by brute force, but through clever tactics and a deep understanding of warfare. Under the leadership of subsequent kings, such as Ancus Marcius, Rome expanded its territory further, founding new cities and securing strategic military outposts. The building of the first bridge across the Tiber River by Ancus Marcius was a critical moment in Rome's development. It allowed for greater movement of troops and resources and connected the city to the growing world beyond its walls. But the key to Rome's future success was not just its military prowess, it was its ability to maintain control over its growing territory. The Etruscans, once Rome's most powerful neighbour, began to lose their grip on central Italy. Rome, initially a city that had been influenced by the Etruscans, had grown stronger and more independent. The creation of Rome's first true city walls was a symbol of this newfound confidence. It wasn't just a defense against external threats, it was a statement that Rome was no longer just a small city-state. It was becoming an empire, a power that would not be easily overthrown. It was during the reign of Tarquinius Priscus, the fifth king of Rome, that the influence of the Etruscans reached its peak in Rome. Tarquinius was an Etruscan, and his reign marked a period of significant growth and ambition. It was under his leadership that Rome's first major public works were begun, including the construction of the great Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, which would become a symbol of Roman power and religious devotion. Tarquinius also initiated the construction of the Circus Maximus, a venue for chariot races that would become one of Rome's most iconic landmarks. But even as Rome expanded, internal strife and power struggles began to emerge. The shift from a monarchy to a republic had been a significant one, but it had also created a political environment ripe for conflict. The power of the kings was no longer absolute, and factions began to form, each seeking control of the city. The growing influence of the military elite, combined with the expansionist policies of Rome, would eventually lead to the collapse of the monarchy and the birth of the Roman Republic. It was in the final days of the monarchy, under the rule of Tarquinius Superbus, that the seeds of rebellion were sown. Superbus, a tyrant whose cruelty and arrogance alienated the Roman elite, would ultimately lead to the fall of the monarchy. His son, Sextus Tarquinius, committed an unspeakable crime. He raped Lucretia, a noblewoman, in an act that would ignite the flames of revolution. The outrage that followed Lucretia's death became the spark that set Rome on a new course. But even as the monarchy was overthrown, Rome's ambition remained unchanged. The republic that replaced the monarchy was a bold experiment, but it was an experiment filled with risk. The ambition that had driven Rome's rise was now focused on the creation of a new political system, a system that would attempt to balance power, but one that would ultimately face challenges it couldn't control. Rome's expansion did not stop with the fall of the monarchy. The Republic, despite its idealistic beginnings, would continue to grow, sometimes through peaceful alliances, sometimes through violent conquests. It was the vision of Rome's leaders, its generals, and its people that would push the city toward greatness. But this vision came at a cost. The Republic would soon find itself grappling with the very forces that had propelled it to power: ambition, betrayal, and the desire for control. Rome's expansion was not just about territory, it was about the creation of a legacy that would influence the entire known world for centuries to come. It would become an empire, not by chance, but by design. The vision of those who ruled it, from the early kings to the generals and statesmen who would follow, was clear. Rome would not just survive, it would dominate. The world was Rome's to conquer, and the price of conquest would be steep. And so, the stage was set for Rome's transformation from a republic into an empire. But that transformation would not come easily. It would take the rise of extraordinary leaders, the fall of countless political systems, and the crushing weight of ambition for Rome to become what it was destined to be. Rome's story was far from over, but as Rome expanded and the Republic took root, the ambition that fueled its rise began to take on new, dangerous forms. The Republic was an experiment that, for all its initial promises, was under constant strain from both internal and external pressures. Rome's leaders, even as they sought to protect their republic, were driven by the same hunger for power that had led to its rise. And it was in the relentless pursuit of that power that Rome's destiny would change forever. Rome's early leaders, particularly the generals and statesmen who came after the monarchy's fall, understood that the world was constantly shifting. The Republic, though designed to limit the power of any single individual, would eventually be overwhelmed by those very forces it sought to contain. The struggle for control between the Senate and military leaders would become one of the defining features of Roman politics. While the Senate represented the old aristocratic order, the generals who commanded the legions saw themselves as the true force behind Rome's greatness. The loyalty of the Roman soldiers was not to the Republic itself, but to their commanders, who promised them land, wealth, and power. This tension between the military and the political elite would shape the future of Rome. As Rome expanded its influence, it began to clash with more powerful and complex societies. The Greek cities in the south, the Etruscans in the north, and the Carthaginians in the Mediterranean posed significant challenges to Rome's rise. But it was through these challenges that Rome honed its strength, its ability to adapt, conquer, and absorb those it defeated. Rome's genius lay not only in its military might but in its political flexibility and ability to forge alliances with its defeated enemies, integrating them into the ever-growing Roman state. But the heart of Rome's transformation lay in its ability to conquer new lands, particularly in the Mediterranean region. The Punic Wars, fought against the seafaring power of Carthage, would prove to be the crucible in which Rome's imperial ambition was solidified. Rome's victory over Carthage in the Second Punic War, under the leadership of the brilliant general Scipio Africanus, marked a decisive turning point in the history of the Republic. No longer would Rome be confined to the Italian peninsula. Now, it looked to dominate the Mediterranean world. The defeat of Hannibal, one of history's greatest generals, proved that no power, no matter how formidable, could stand in Rome's way. The Roman legions, while initially untested on the seas, had shown themselves to be adaptable, capable of defeating their enemies not only on land, but also through innovation and determination. This victory, however, came at a price. The Republic's military success had stretched its resources and tested the endurance of its political system. The power of the generals continued to grow, and with it, the ambitions of the men who led them. Military victories were now equated with personal glory, and as more generals returned to Rome triumphant, they brought with them the loyalty of their legions. In time, the loyalty of the soldiers to their commanders would threaten the very foundations of the Republic. It was during this time of expansion and ambition that the Republic began to fray at the edges. Rome's leaders, ever hungry for power, would turn their gaze inward. The Senate, once the body that held ultimate power, became increasingly irrelevant as the generals such as Marius, Sulla, and Julius Caesar used their armies to push for political control. The struggle between these military giants would mark the beginning of the end for the Roman Republic. Julius Caesar's rise was not a mere political maneuver. It was a reflection of the political decay that had taken root in Rome. His victory in Gaul and his subsequent crossing of the Rubicon, with his army behind him, shattered the delicate balance of power in Rome. Caesar's march on Rome was not just a military campaign, it was a statement. The die was cast, and with it, the death knell of the Republic. As Caesar's power grew, so too did his ambition. His conquest of Gaul, one of the most remarkable military campaigns in history, had expanded Rome's borders, but it also set the stage for the destruction of the Republic. Caesar's growing influence, coupled with his manipulation of political alliances and his charisma, made him a figure of unparalleled power. But in doing so, he also sealed his fate. The very men who had once been his allies, the members of the Senate, saw Caesar's power as a threat to their own. His assassination, led by a group of senators who feared his rise to absolute power, marked the final chapter of the Roman Republic. Yet, the death of Caesar did not mark the end of his ambitions. It only sowed the seeds for an even greater conflict, one that would bring about the transformation of Rome from a republic into an empire. The struggle for control after Caesar's death between his adopted son Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus would lead to the formation of the Second Triumvirate. This alliance, however, was short-lived, as the rivalry between Octavian and Antony, each backed by powerful military forces, would eventually result in the Battle of Actium. The defeat of Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium and the subsequent suicides of both Antony and Cleopatra marked the end of the Republic's long struggle for survival. Octavian, now the undisputed ruler of Rome, would be granted the title of Augustus by the Senate, effectively marking the birth of the Roman Empire. But Augustus, unlike Caesar, understood the delicate nature of power. He cleverly disguised his absolute rule under the facade of republican institutions, presenting himself not as a king, but as the first citizen of Rome. In doing so, he was able to establish a system that would endure for centuries, the imperial system of governance that would become the hallmark of Roman dominance. The rise of Augustus was not simply the rise of an individual, it was the rise of a new world order. Rome had finally achieved its goal of becoming an empire, but it had done so at the cost of its ideals. The Republic, built on the principles of shared power and democratic governance, had been replaced by a system that placed ultimate authority in the hands of one man. The empire that Augustus established would be characterized by the very forces that had destroyed the Republic power, ambition, and control. Yet, in spite of its flaws, the empire he created would last for centuries, shaping the world in ways that would continue to reverberate through history. And so, as Rome transitioned from a republic to an empire, it left behind a legacy that would influence not just its own world, but the world that would follow. The idea of Roman citizenship, the system of laws, the military organization, and the very structure of empire itself. These were the tools that Rome would use to build a civilization that would stand the test of time. The Republic may have fallen, but the empire that arose from its ashes would go on to dominate the known world for centuries to come. The rise of the Roman Empire, once a city-state on the banks of the Tiber, marks one of the most remarkable transformations in human history. By the time Augustus had established the imperial system, Rome was no longer merely a powerful city, it was the embodiment of military supremacy, political acumen, and cultural dominance. The seeds of its growth, however, lay not just in the ability to conquer foreign lands, but in the struggle to maintain unity and control over a rapidly expanding empire. The story of Rome's imperial expansion is not just one of military conquests. It is a tale of the internal contradictions that shaped its destiny. Rome's strength in war was matched only by its vulnerabilities in governance. The Roman Empire was built on conquest, on the belief that power must always be seized, never given. Yet, as it expanded, Rome began to grapple with the very forces of power that had propelled it to greatness. The vast stretch of territories, the constant pressure of external enemies, and the complexity of internal governance would prove to be the empire's greatest challenge. Rome's territorial expansion began as a response to immediate threats, but it quickly turned into an aggressive campaign to secure dominance in the Mediterranean. From the distant reaches of Hispania to the fertile plains of North Africa, from the sands of Egypt to the icy lands of the north, Rome's armies advanced, claiming territory and absorbing diverse peoples into its fold. The Punic Wars were Rome's crucible, a series of brutal conflicts that saw the rise of Rome as a naval and military powerhouse, capable of defeating the formidable Carthaginian forces and, most notably, Hannibal, one of the greatest military tacticians in history. The Second Punic War, with its dramatic battles, had taught Rome invaluable lessons in resilience and adaptability. The Roman legions, at first inexperienced in naval warfare, learned to defeat their enemies through sheer will and innovation. This would become a hallmark of Roman military success, their ability to adapt, to take their failures and turn them into strengths. The Romans, more than any other civilization, understood that military might was not just about numbers. It was about discipline, strategy, and the ability to learn from defeat. But while the military expanded, so too did the complexities of governance. Rome's success in war created new problems. The empire began to stretch beyond the capacity of its republican system, which, though designed to balance power, became increasingly incapable of managing a sprawling empire. As Rome absorbed more territories, it faced the ever-growing difficulty of maintaining control over such a vast expanse. The question of how to govern these new lands became as important as the question of how to win them. At the heart of Rome's governance was the Senate, a body that had, in the early days of the Republic, represented the will of the aristocratic elite. But as the empire grew, so too did the demands placed on the Senate. It became less about representation and more about maintaining control over an increasingly unstable political environment. The Senate's authority, once supreme, began to erode as generals, once loyal to the state, began to use their power for personal gain. The transition from republic to empire was marked not only by military conquests, but by a shift in the very structure of Roman governance. The rise of Julius Caesar was the beginning of the end for the Roman Republic. His conquests, particularly in Gaul, had made him one of the most powerful men in Rome. His loyalty to the Roman people was unquestionable, but his growing power posed a serious threat to the balance of the Republic. The Senate, fearful of his influence, saw Caesar as a potential dictator. This fear culminated in the assassination of Caesar, a tragic and pivotal moment in Roman history. But the death of Caesar did not bring stability. Instead, it plunged Rome into a civil war that would ultimately end with the rise of Augustus, the first emperor. Augustus understood that Rome could no longer function as a republic. The political system that had served Rome for centuries was now a broken relic. The Senate, which had once been the most powerful body in the Republic, was now a shadow of its former self. Yet Augustus did not abolish the Senate. Rather, he carefully restored it, keeping the illusion of republican governance while consolidating ultimate power in his hands. He understood that stability in Rome could only be achieved through centralized control. Augustus reformed the political system, creating the foundations of what would become the Roman Empire. Despite his reforms, Augustus faced constant challenges. The empire was vast, and the territories it encompassed were diverse, each with its own customs, languages, and political systems. Rome's ability to maintain control over its provinces, to integrate conquered peoples into the Roman system, became critical to its survival. The Roman Empire was not a monolithic entity. It was a complex mosaic of different cultures, and its expansion was as much about managing these differences as it was about military conquest. The challenges of governing such a vast empire would soon become apparent. As Augustus's reign progressed, the Roman Empire's borders were pushed even further. The Romans conquered Britain, brought the entire Iberian Peninsula under their control, and established dominance over much of Gaul. Yet, the more Rome expanded, the more it was confronted with internal strife. The empire, though vast and powerful, was not impervious to corruption, factionalism, and power struggles. The political system Augustus had put in place would be tested time and again, particularly by those who sought to undo his work and return to the traditional republican values. The first signs of internal decline were evident during the reigns of Augustus's successors. While the empire expanded to its greatest territorial extent under Trajan, it was also during this period that the seeds of Rome's eventual decline were planted. The vast empire was too large to be governed effectively, and the reliance on military expansion as a means of securing power began to backfire. The pressures of controlling such a diverse and expansive territory led to tensions within the military, which, in turn, destabilized the political system. By the 3rd century AD, the empire's borders were under constant threat from barbarian invasions. The traditional Roman military system, which had once been the backbone of the empire, began to fracture. Roman legions, which had once been the epitome of discipline and strength, were now increasingly made up of mercenaries from foreign lands. The Roman elite, once the backbone of the empire's political stability, had become detached from the reality of governing such a vast and diverse empire. Corruption, complacency, and infighting weakened the political structure, making it increasingly difficult to defend the empire from external threats. The crisis of the 3rd century marked the beginning of the end for the Roman Empire. The once unified empire now struggled with internal division and external pressure. The empire was divided into two halves: the Western Roman Empire, which struggled with economic and military decline, and the Eastern Roman Empire, which eventually became the Byzantine Empire. The division was, in many ways, a reflection of the empire's internal disintegration. Despite the challenges, the Roman Empire continued to exert influence across the Mediterranean world. The legacy of Roman law, culture, and governance lived on, even as the empire itself began to unravel. Rome's ability to create lasting institutions, to integrate diverse peoples into its system, and to create a lasting cultural impact is what ensured its place in history. Even as the Western Roman Empire fell to barbarian invasions, the idea of Rome, the concept of Roman citizenship, and the institutions it created lived on in the Byzantine Empire and later in the institutions of medieval Europe. The legacy of Rome, in many ways, was more important than the empire itself. As the centuries passed, the Roman Empire's expansionist drive began to show its cracks. The ambition to conquer and integrate diverse peoples into the Roman system had once been a source of strength, but it now revealed itself as a double-edged sword. Rome's rapid territorial expansion had brought together a vast array of cultures, languages, and customs under one imperial banner. But this diversity, which had once been managed by Rome's genius for assimilation, was now becoming difficult to control. The complexities of governing such a vast and culturally diverse empire were becoming overwhelming. The imperial system, designed to maintain order and unity, was increasingly tested by the internal contradictions it had long carried. The power of the Senate had long since been diminished, and yet it remained a symbol of Roman republican values, a reminder of the power once held by the people. Augustus had cleverly maintained the Senate's authority, but in doing so, he had created a system where real power was concentrated in the hands of the emperor. This meant that, as long as the emperor was strong, the empire could maintain stability, but when leadership faltered, as it inevitably would, the very foundation of Rome's governance became unstable. The Roman elite, once a powerful and cohesive force, had become fragmented. The empire was vast, and the demands of managing such an enormous territory weighed heavily on the emperor. As new territories were conquered, the question of how to manage them became more urgent. It was not enough to merely subdue enemies. Rome needed to integrate them into its systems, providing governance and infrastructure that could support an empire of such magnitude. In the early years of imperial Rome, military conquest was seen as the most direct way to expand power and influence. The legions, composed primarily of Roman citizens, had a fierce loyalty to the empire and its ideals. But as the empire expanded, Rome became increasingly reliant on mercenaries from foreign lands, soldiers who were not as invested in Rome's success, and whose loyalty was less certain. This shift marked the beginning of a dangerous trend. The Roman legions, once the epitome of discipline, became more and more filled with men who fought for pay, not for the glory of Rome. As the military lost its original character, so too did the empire's ability to defend itself against external threats. The reign of the so-called barracks emperors in the 3rd century, where generals were often elevated to the throne after a military coup, further eroded the power of the traditional Roman political system. Rome's military system, which had once been a source of stability, now became the instrument of chaos. The army was no longer a unified force under the command of a single emperor. Instead, it became a fragmented force, constantly at war with itself and with external invaders. As internal division and external threats mounted, the Western Roman Empire began to buckle under the pressure. The crises of the 3rd century had left the empire economically strained, with its borders increasingly vulnerable to barbarian invasions. The Visigoths, Vandals, and Huns all pressed in on the empire from different fronts. The once mighty Roman legions, spread thin and weakened, were unable to repel these forces, and the empire's borders began to crumble. In the east, the Byzantine Empire, though still under the banner of Rome, faced its own set of challenges. While the Eastern Roman Empire managed to hold on longer than the West, it too was not immune to the pressures that had caused the collapse of the Western Empire. The empire's vastness and complexity were reflected in the divisions between the eastern and western parts of the empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, had access to more resources and was better positioned geographically, but it still faced the constant threat of invasions and internal unrest. The fall of the Western Roman Empire, traditionally marked by the sack of Rome in 476 AD, was not a sudden collapse but the culmination of centuries of decline. The final act of this slow death was not just an invasion by foreign forces, but a combination of military decline, political instability, economic collapse, and the erosion of Roman cultural identity. As the Western Empire disintegrated, the Eastern Empire continued to function, though its eventual fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 would mark the final end of the Roman Empire as a political entity. Despite the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the cultural and political legacy of Rome endured. Roman law, governance, and military organization were absorbed into the emerging medieval states that rose from the ashes of the old empire. The concept of Roman citizenship continued to influence European political thought for centuries. The rise of the Holy Roman Empire in the medieval period was a direct attempt to revive the idea of Rome and its governance. Even in the Renaissance, scholars and rulers look back to Rome's history, its triumphs and failures, as a model for how to govern a unified, powerful state. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Rome lies in its legal and political contributions. Roman law became the foundation for the legal systems of much of Europe and later the Americas. The concept of citizenship, with its rights and responsibilities, was developed under the Romans and remains a core aspect of modern political systems. The Roman Empire, though it fell politically, never truly disappeared. It transformed, adapting to the changing political and cultural landscape. As the centuries passed, the memory of Rome remained deeply embedded in the fabric of Western civilization. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire did not mark the end of Roman influence. It simply signaled the beginning of a new era. The legacy of Rome lived on in the institutions, laws, and systems that it had left behind. It continued to shape the development of Europe, and through European colonization, it spread across the globe. Rome's intellectual, legal, and cultural heritage became the bedrock of modern Western civilization. In the end, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire serve as a powerful reminder of the fragility of power. Rome, for all its glory, could not escape the forces of internal division and external pressure that eventually led to its downfall. Yet, in its legacy, we see the indomitable spirit of a civilization that, though it perished, continues to influence the world today. The story of Rome's rise and fall is not just the story of an empire, it is the story of human ambition, triumph, and failure. A story that echoes through the halls of history and continues to shape the modern world. The Roman Empire, a monumental civilization that once stretched across vast continents, seemed, for much of its history, invincible. At its peak, it was a powerhouse of military, political, and cultural dominance, wielding influence over the entire Mediterranean world. The story of Rome's rise was one of triumph over adversity, of a small city-state on the Tiber becoming the greatest empire the world had ever known. Yet, as with all great powers, Rome's journey was not one of uninterrupted progress. It was a path marked by extraordinary peaks and inevitable troughs, by moments of unparalleled glory and slow, painful decline. What happened to this great empire? How did it go from commanding the known world to being fragmented and decayed, divided in both governance and spirit? The answer lies not in a single moment, but in a series of crises, internal and external, that gradually chipped away at the foundation of Roman power. These crises didn't happen in isolation, but rather, they were the result of a combination of military overreach, political instability, and social and economic shifts that would forever alter the course of history. As the empire expanded, it became increasingly difficult to govern and maintain control over its vast territories. The shift from a republic to an empire under Augustus had created a new form of leadership, but this centralization of power was not without its flaws. Augustus had established a stable system by disguising autocracy under the facade of republican institutions, but after his death, the foundations of Roman imperial governance were severely tested by both external enemies and internal conflicts. One of the most significant challenges was the sheer scale of the empire. The size of Rome's territorial holdings had grown to such an extent that it was difficult to administer effectively. Roman legions, once the backbone of the empire's military might, were now spread thin across far-flung borders, constantly defending against invasions from external enemies. The vastness of the empire, stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Germania, made it impossible for the central government to maintain complete control. The provinces, once governed by Roman officials loyal to the empire, began to develop a level of autonomy. As Roman military might was stretched across its territories, the empire's cohesion started to fray. The crisis of leadership was perhaps the most profound of all the internal struggles. After the reign of Augustus, the empire witnessed a series of rulers who, though powerful in their own right, lacked the political insight and strategic vision necessary to manage an empire of such vast complexity. The system of succession was flawed. Emperors did not always have heirs who could follow in their footsteps, and those who succeeded them often lacked the experience and authority required to govern effectively. Corruption within the imperial court, coupled with a lack of trust in the Senate and other governing bodies, led to a period of instability that further weakened the empire. Throughout the early centuries of the empire, emperors such as Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero faced significant opposition from both the elite and the common people. While some emperors, like Trajan and Hadrian, brought stability and expansion, many others failed to meet the empire's needs. The political environment became more volatile, as the emperors became more authoritarian, and the lines between ruler and tyrant blurred. The lack of accountability and the growing centralization of power made it increasingly difficult for Rome's political institutions to function effectively. As political instability deepened, so too did the social and economic fractures within the empire. The vast wealth that Rome had accumulated through conquest and trade began to create inequality. While the elite enjoyed immense riches, the lower classes, particularly the slaves and poor citizens, were left to suffer in the shadow of imperial prosperity. The grain dole, once a source of bread and circuses for the masses, was no longer sufficient to quell the growing discontent among the population. Economic inequality, coupled with a series of devastating plagues, led to widespread unrest. The Roman military, once the pride of the empire, was also undergoing a transformation. As the empire grew, the traditional Roman legions, made up of Roman citizens, began to be supplemented by mercenaries from barbarian tribes. This created a shift in the loyalty of the military. Once fiercely loyal to Rome, these soldiers were now motivated by pay rather than patriotism. This was a dangerous development, as it meant that the Roman army was no longer an entirely reliable force. In fact, by the 3rd century AD, the empire began to see more and more instances of military leaders declaring themselves emperor, leading to a period of political instability and division known as the crisis of the 3rd century. The crisis was marked by constant civil war, military usurpations, and the fragmentation of the empire. The once unified empire was now divided into competing factions, with different regions under the control of different generals and would-be emperors. During this time, the Roman Empire was temporarily divided into the Gallic Empire, the Palmyrene Empire, and the Central Roman Empire. While the empire did manage to reunite under Emperor Aurelian, the damage had been done. The concept of Roman unity had been shattered, and the empire was never quite the same again. The growing threat of external invasions only added to Rome's woes. The empire's borders were increasingly threatened by barbarian invasions, with the Goths, Vandals, Huns, and other tribes pressing on Rome's frontiers. The empire, which had once defeated the fiercest enemies through superior tactics and organization, was now struggling to keep up with the waves of invaders. The once mighty legions were no longer able to repel the barbarians effectively, and over time, the empire's ability to defend its borders deteriorated. The culmination of these internal and external crises came in 476 AD, when the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the barbarian leader Odoacer. This event, traditionally seen as the fall of the Western Roman Empire, marked the end of over 1,000 years of Roman domination in the West. However, it would be a mistake to view this moment as the abrupt end of Rome's influence. The Eastern Roman Empire, which had its capital in Constantinople, continued to survive for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire. But even the Byzantine Empire, though it carried on the traditions and legacy of Rome, faced its own struggles. The Eastern Empire was beset by constant invasions from the Seljuk Turks, and later the Ottoman Turks. Despite efforts to revive the empire, including Emperor Justinian's grand vision of restoring the glory of Rome, the Byzantine Empire eventually fell to the Ottomans in 1453. While the Western Roman Empire may have crumbled, its legacy lived on. Roman law, governance, and military organization continued to influence civilizations long after the fall of Rome. The fall of the empire did not mark the end of Roman culture, but rather the beginning of a transformation that would be felt for centuries. Roman influence persisted in the Byzantine Empire, in medieval Europe, and in the intellectual and cultural movements of the Renaissance. The story of Rome's rise and fall is a timeless lesson in the dangers of overreach, the fragility of political systems, and the inherent contradictions of power. The Roman Empire, in all its grandeur, was unable to escape the forces of internal division and external threats that eventually led to its collapse. Yet, in its fall, it left behind a legacy that would shape the future of the world for generations to come. The idea of Roman citizenship, the concept of Roman law, and the structure of Roman governance would be woven into the fabric of Western civilization, influencing political thought and governance for centuries. In the end, the fall of the Roman Empire was not a cataclysmic event, but the culmination of centuries of challenges that Rome, in its greatness, could not overcome. And though the empire itself may have fallen, the principles that Rome embodied, military discipline, political organization, and the rule of law, remained as guiding lights for the civilizations that followed. Rome's legacy is not just in its conquests, but in its ability to adapt, to change, and to influence the course of human history long after its walls had crumbled. As the centuries wore on, the internal tensions within the Roman Empire became increasingly unmanageable. The once unified empire, built on the strength of its military and the unity of its people, was now fragmented. The very systems that had allowed Rome to flourish were now contributing to its decline. With its vast territories and increasingly complex administrative needs, Rome's political structure, built around a Senate that had once been an essential governing body, was failing to meet the challenges of such an immense empire. The imperial bureaucracy grew more convoluted, and corruption began to seep into its ranks. The very essence of the Roman system's centralized control efficient governance, and the application of law began to unravel. This decay was not just political, it was social and economic as well. The Roman elite had once been bound together by a shared identity, a common vision of Rome's greatness. But over time, that unity fractured. Economic inequality widened, and the gap between the rich and the poor became impossible to ignore. The wealth that flowed into Rome, thanks to conquests and trade, was no longer enough to sustain the empire. The maintenance of such a vast military apparatus and the infrastructure needed to support the empire's borders became unsustainable. The poor, who had once been provided for through the grain dole, now found themselves struggling to survive in an economy that had shifted away from agricultural production to luxury goods and trade with the Eastern empires. The increasing reliance on slave labor further exacerbated social divisions, as the free population found itself squeezed by a system that only seemed to benefit the elite. In this environment, the very foundations of Roman society began to crumble. The political system was in turmoil, with military leaders gaining power and undermining the Senate's authority. This would culminate in the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of civil war, foreign invasions, and political instability. During this time, the empire split into 3 competing entities: the Gallic Empire, the Palmyrene Empire, and the Central Roman Empire, and the illusion of unity was shattered. One of the greatest challenges of this period was the constant pressure from external threats. Rome had always been a military superpower, but its enemies had grown more numerous and more powerful. The Goths, Vandals, Huns, and other barbarian tribes were pressing on the empire's borders from all directions. Once, Rome had been able to use its military strength to keep these enemies at bay, but now the legions were spread thin and increasingly reliant on mercenaries. The empire's ability to defend its frontiers diminished as the loyalty of its military became more questionable. The Visigoths' sack of Rome in 410 AD marked a key moment in the empire's decline. Although the city of Rome itself had been sacked before, this event had a profound psychological impact on the empire. For the first time, the Romans realized that their great city, once considered invulnerable, was no longer immune to external forces. The sack was a symbolic moment, demonstrating that the empire had lost its former might. From this point forward, the empire would continue to weaken as successive barbarian invasions eroded its ability to defend itself. The internal decay within the empire only made matters worse. As the Roman elite became more corrupt and disconnected from the people, the empire struggled to maintain its cohesion. Civil wars raged between rival factions, each fighting for control of the empire. By the time of Emperor Diocletian's reforms in the late 3rd century, the empire had been irreparably divided. The Western Roman Empire, weakened by internal strife and external invasions, was facing its final days, while the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, managed to survive for several more centuries. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD marked the official end of Rome's dominance in the West. The last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the barbarian leader Odoacer, signaling the end of the Roman world as it had been known. But while the Western Roman Empire had fallen, the idea of Rome, its law, its citizenship, its culture did not vanish. As the centuries passed, the legacy of Rome lived on in the Byzantine Empire, which preserved much of Roman law, governance, and culture. The Byzantine Empire, although culturally and geographically distinct from its predecessor, was the direct heir to Rome's imperial traditions. It became a bridge between the ancient world and the medieval era, carrying forward the ideals of Roman civilization into the Middle Ages. Even after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the ideas and principles of Rome continued to influence the course of history. The concept of Roman law shaped the development of legal systems in Europe, and Roman political structures informed the governance of many medieval and early modern states. The Renaissance, a period of great cultural rebirth, saw a revival of interest in Roman art, philosophy, and literature. Artists, thinkers, and rulers looked back to Rome as the ideal model of civilization, drawing inspiration from its achievements in architecture, engineering, and governance. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not the end of Rome, but rather the beginning of a new chapter. Rome's legacy continued to shape the world long after its political power had faded. Its influence on law, governance, and culture has endured throughout the centuries, leaving an indelible mark on Western civilization. The story of Rome is not just a tale of imperial conquest, but a testament to the enduring power of ideas. Rome's ideals of citizenship, law, and governance have lived on, shaping the modern world in ways that would have seemed unimaginable to its ancient citizens. In the end, Rome's greatest legacy lies not in its conquests or its territorial holdings, but in its ability to adapt, to create lasting institutions, and to influence the course of history for generations to come. Even as its walls crumbled, its spirit lived on, carried by the institutions and ideas that were born in the heart of the empire. The Roman Empire may have fallen, but the idea of Rome remains alive, echoing through the corridors of history and continuing to shape our understanding of civilization itself. The Roman Empire, a beacon of political organization, military might, and cultural dominance, transformed from the city-state of Rome to a sprawling, complex empire that reached its peak as the supreme power of the ancient world. The story of its rise is etched in history as a narrative of unimaginable grandeur. Yet, as remarkable as its ascent was, the decline of Rome, though tragic, would offer even more lasting lessons to future generations. For in the ruins of the empire, in the ashes of its former greatness, lay the seeds for the shaping of a new world. Rome's legacy was never purely confined to the realm of its territorial empire. From its very beginning, as a small village at the edge of the Mediterranean, Rome proved to be a city of astonishing adaptability. It conquered, it learned, and it became the foundation of what we know today as Western civilization. The Romans didn't just build an empire. They created a lasting system of governance, legal structures, and cultural frameworks that would influence future empires and republics for millennia to come. Rome's shift from a republic to an empire was a defining moment in world history. The republic, with its democratic ideals and complex system of checks and balances, held power in the hands of the people, albeit of a specific class. This system had its strengths, but it also had inherent weaknesses. The internal power struggles, the constant conflict between the patricians and plebeians, the inefficiency of the Senate, and the inability of the system to adapt to the needs of a rapidly expanding Rome led to political instability. It was during these times of internal chaos that the idea of a centralized leadership of a single ruler capable of maintaining order and stability gained momentum. Julius Caesar's rise to power was a consequence of these very fractures in the Roman political system. Though his ambitions were masked under the guise of loyalty to the people and the Republic, Caesar's increasing power ultimately threatened the very foundation of Roman political life. His assassination in 44 BCE, though it was intended to preserve the Republic, instead accelerated Rome's transformation from a republican system to a centralized imperial system under Augustus. Augustus's reign marked the beginning of the Roman Empire, an era that saw the end of the chaotic politics of the Republic and the beginning of a new kind of leadership, where the emperor held supreme power but also wielded a certain level of respect for the traditional republican institutions. This transition, however, was not without its challenges. The fall of the Republic was not just about the concentration of power in the hands of one man, but about the changing nature of Roman governance itself. Under Augustus and his successors, the Senate continued to exist, and the outward appearance of the Republic was maintained for a time. However, the Senate's power had been reduced to that of a figurehead, and real power now resided with the emperor. The idea of a ruler who was the first citizen, rather than a king, was an essential part of Augustus's plan to avoid the kind of monarchy that had previously led to the fall of other empires. However, despite these efforts to preserve the image of the Republic, the empire was built on the foundation of autocracy. As the empire expanded, so too did the complexities of governance. The size of the Roman Empire was both its strength and its downfall. The vast stretch of territories from the deserts of Egypt to the cold northern reaches of Britain, from the plains of Africa to the fertile hills of Gaul, made it increasingly difficult for a single, centralized government to manage. The need for strong military leaders, loyal administrators, and a functioning bureaucracy became paramount. Over time, however, these very aspects of Roman strength began to fray. The military, once the backbone of Roman power, began to weaken as the empire expanded. No longer made up of loyal Roman citizens, the legions became increasingly dependent on mercenaries, many of whom were from the very barbarian tribes that Rome once fought to defend itself against. These mercenaries were motivated more by pay than loyalty, and their divided loyalties would contribute to the internal instability that plagued Rome. By the time the empire reached its greatest territorial extent under Emperor Trajan in the 2nd century CE, the challenges of governance and defense were already becoming apparent. The vast borders of the empire were increasingly difficult to defend, and the reliance on mercenary forces further eroded the cohesion of the military. As Rome's borders grew, so too did its internal divisions. The political system, once characterized by a careful balance of power, was increasingly marked by corruption, ambition, and factionalism. The emperors, though often powerful and capable in their own right, struggled to manage the empire's sprawling territories and the increasing demands of its population. The crises of the 3rd century were perhaps the most significant tipping point for the Roman Empire. The once unified empire splintered into competing factions, with various military leaders and usurpers vying for power. This period, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, was marked by constant civil war, invasions from barbarian tribes, and a general sense of disintegration. The empire temporarily split into 3 parts: the Gallic Empire, the Palmyrene Empire, and the Central Roman Empire. Though the empire was reunified under Emperor Aurelian, the damage had already been done. The political unity that had once been Rome's strength was now shattered, and the empire would never return to its former state of cohesion. Despite the crises that marked its decline, the Roman Empire was not without its resilience. Even as its political and military systems began to crack, Rome continued to exert its influence across the Mediterranean. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Rome, would survive for another 1,000 years, even as the Western Roman Empire fell. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE marked the end of Roman political dominance in the West, but the ideas and structures that Rome had created would continue to shape the future. Roman law, Roman citizenship, and Roman governance would live on long after the fall of Rome itself. The concepts of justice, civic duty, and the rule of law, which had been pioneered in Rome, would serve as the foundation for the legal systems of many European countries. The idea of citizenship, once reserved for the elites, became a broader concept, influencing the way in which later societies viewed the relationship between the individual and the state. Even after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the legacy of Roman culture continued to shape the Western world. The Renaissance, a time of great intellectual and artistic flourishing, saw a revival of Roman ideas in art, architecture, and philosophy. The classical ideals of Rome, the focus on rationality, the importance of civic virtue, and the pursuit of knowledge became a cornerstone of the intellectual movement that sought to rediscover the greatness of the ancient world. Roman culture also influenced the development of political thought. The Roman Republic, with its system of checks and balances, separation of powers, and emphasis on civic duty, provided a model for later political systems. The founding fathers of the United States, for instance, drew heavily on Roman political philosophy when designing the structure of the American government. The Roman ideal of a mixed constitution, one that balanced the power of the rulers, the Senate, and the people, became a guiding principle for the formation of modern democracies. Perhaps, most importantly, Rome's ability to adapt in the face of adversity and change left behind a legacy that continues to resonate today. The fall of the empire was not a singular event, but a gradual process, one that highlighted the inherent flaws in any system of governance, no matter how powerful. Rome's fall was a testament to the fragility of empires, the difficulty of maintaining unity across vast territories, and the dangers of unchecked ambition and overreach. Yet in its decline, Rome provided a model for how civilizations can transform and endure even after political power has waned. In the end, the story of Rome is not just the story of an empire, but of humanity's struggle to balance power, governance, and unity. It serves as a cautionary tale of the costs of empire building, but also as an enduring example of the transformative power of ideas. Rome may have fallen, but its legacy, the ideas, the institutions, and the culture lives on in the world we live in today. The empire may have crumbled, but the ideals of Rome will echo through the centuries, continuing to shape the future of civilizations across the globe. The fall of the Roman Empire, though a defining moment in history, was not a singular, abrupt event. It was a prolonged process, unfolding over centuries, with various factors slowly eroding the once mighty civilization. Yet, in this decline, there lies an ironic truth. Even as the empire collapsed under the weight of its internal contradictions and external pressures, its legacy only grew stronger. The Roman Empire may have fallen, but the ideas it birthed, the systems it established, and the cultural framework it laid out would shape the course of history for generations to come. One of the most enduring aspects of Rome's legacy is its system of law. Roman law was groundbreaking in its structure and its emphasis on individual rights, legal equality, and justice. The Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, became the foundation for many legal systems that would evolve throughout Europe and the rest of the world. Its principles, such as the presumption of innocence, the concept of due process, and the notion that law should be written and accessible, are still alive and central in modern judicial systems. These principles, established by the Romans, became crucial to the development of Western legal systems. In fact, much of what we understand today as modern law traces its roots directly to Roman legal thought. The concept of citizenship, which was originally reserved for Roman elites, expanded over time and became a broader concept, influencing the development of national identities. The Roman approach to governance, wherein the rights and responsibilities of citizens were clearly outlined, would be taken up and adapted by later civilizations, especially in the context of republican forms of government. The Roman Republic's notion of a mixed constitution, blending elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, served as a direct inspiration for the development of modern democratic systems, particularly the United States. The Founding Fathers, in their quest to build a government that would endure for centuries, borrowed heavily from Roman republican ideals. The balance of power between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches that we take for granted today was directly influenced by Roman models of governance. The legacy of Rome's political philosophy is woven into the fabric of modern political thought, and it continues to influence the political systems of many countries today. Beyond governance and law, Roman culture also had a profound impact on the arts, philosophy, and education. Roman culture, with its appreciation for rhetoric, logic, and civic virtue, laid the groundwork for the intellectual movements that followed. During the Renaissance, thinkers, artists, and writers looked back to Rome for inspiration, reviving the classical ideals of Roman art and literature. The philosophical and artistic traditions that Rome cultivated continue to influence Western culture, from the grand buildings of Europe to the paintings and sculptures that adorn museums around the world. Furthermore, the Roman model of infrastructure, its roads, aqueducts, public baths, and marketplaces, set the standard for urban planning and public works. The Romans revolutionized the concept of city building, creating spaces designed to be functional, efficient, and accessible to all citizens. Their engineering feats, particularly the development of concrete and their mastery of arches and vaults, allowed for the construction of structures that would endure for millennia. Many of Rome's architectural and engineering innovations, from the Colosseum to the Pantheon, continue to inspire architects and engineers today. Roman innovations also had an enduring impact on military organization and strategy. The Roman legions were renowned for their discipline, organization, and ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The Roman military's focus on training, logistics, and innovation, emphasizing both strategy and tactics, provided a model that would be studied and emulated by military leaders throughout history. The concept of a professional standing army, composed of well-trained soldiers loyal to the state, was revolutionary and became the backbone of many subsequent empires. However, the greatest lesson that the fall of Rome offers is the fragility of empires. The Roman Empire's collapse serves as a reminder of the dangers of overextension both militarily and politically. Rome's inability to manage its vast territories, its reliance on mercenaries rather than loyal citizens, and its struggle to address growing economic inequalities all contributed to its eventual downfall. The political instability, corruption, and factionalism that took root in Rome during the final centuries of its reign created an empire that was increasingly difficult to govern. Yet, in the ruins of the Roman Empire, there was also rebirth. The Byzantine Empire, which carried the legacy of Rome for another millennium, would continue many of the Roman traditions in the East. Even after Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, Roman ideals continued to shape the course of European history. The Renaissance, a period of cultural awakening, was deeply rooted in the rediscovery of classical Roman thought and art. Today, the idea of Rome continues to echo in the world we live in. The ideals of Roman citizenship, the importance of law, the structure of governance, and the achievements in engineering and culture persist in countless ways. Rome's ability to adapt to changing circumstances, its capacity for growth, reform, and renewal has left an indelible mark on civilization. While the Roman Empire itself may have crumbled, the spirit of Rome endures in the values it upheld and the institutions it established. The story of Rome's rise and fall is a timeless reminder of the forces that shape history. The empire's fall was not the end of its influence. Rather, it was the beginning of a new chapter in the story of human civilization. The lessons of Rome are not just lessons of the past. They are lessons that continue to shape our future. From the principles of Roman law to the ideals of republican governance, from the engineering marvels of Roman infrastructure to the enduring cultural legacy of Roman art and philosophy, Rome's influence is woven into the very fabric of the modern world. In the end, the fall of the Roman Empire is not just a story of decline, it is a story of transformation. The empire may have crumbled, but its principles, ideas, and culture continue to shape the world we live in today. The empire may be gone, but the legacy of Rome, its power, its ideals, and its influence will endure for centuries to come. The history of the Roman Empire is one of extraordinary rise and equally extraordinary decline, but at the core of its journey lies an undeniable truth. The empire, though it fell, never truly disappeared. Instead, it transformed, reshaping the world in ways that still echo through our present day. The fall of Rome marks the end of one era, but it also signals the beginning of a new world order, one that would carry the legacies of Rome into the future. This transformation, however, was not instantaneous. It was a slow and painful process that unfolded over centuries. What led to the downfall of the Roman Empire is a complex question, and the answer lies not in a singular cause, but in a web of interconnected factors, military, political, economic, and social, that over time weakened and fractured what was once an indomitable power. Rome, at its peak, ruled over vast territories, its armies marching from the deserts of North Africa to the cold, windswept hills of Britain. It was a force unmatched in terms of its reach and influence, with an economy based on conquest and trade, and a system of governance that blended elements of democracy with autocracy. It seemed invincible, impervious to the forces that had toppled other civilizations before it. However, as the centuries wore on, the weight of its own empire became too much to bear. Rome's downfall did not come from a single catastrophic event, but from the accumulation of pressures from within and without. First and foremost, the sheer size of the Roman Empire played a significant role in its eventual collapse. At its height, the empire stretched across 3 continents, from the wild expanses of Germania in the north to the sun-baked sands of Egypt in the south, from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the mountains of Mesopotamia in the east. With such a vast empire, the logistical challenge of maintaining control became overwhelming. The once highly disciplined and unified Roman legions, which had conquered much of the known world, were stretched thin across the empire's extensive borders. Roman military power, which had been a symbol of Rome's dominance, began to falter. Roman soldiers, once composed of Roman citizens, were now increasingly supplemented by mercenaries. These mercenaries, often recruited from the very barbarian tribes that once posed a threat to the empire, had little loyalty to Rome itself, and were motivated by pay rather than patriotism. This weakening of the military's unity and discipline was one of the early cracks in the foundation of the empire. Moreover, as Rome expanded, its political system struggled to keep pace. The Roman Republic, founded on the principles of shared power, had been designed to govern a city-state, not an empire. The expansion of the empire created new challenges. How could the Senate, once the supreme governing body of Rome, to effectively oversee an empire that stretched so far? How could a republic, founded on the ideas of civic participation, remain relevant when its leaders were increasingly military men focused on expansion and conquest? Over time, the republic's checks and balances began to erode, and as ambitious generals gained more power, the Senate became a shadow of its former self. The political system, originally designed to balance the interests of the elite and the people, could no longer manage the complex needs of an empire. The shift from republic to empire began with the rise of Julius Caesar, whose military conquests and political maneuvering made him the most powerful man in Rome. Despite his popularity, Caesar's growing power alarmed the Senate, leading to his assassination in 44 BCE. His death did not restore the republic, however. Instead, it opened the door for the rise of Augustus, who would become the first emperor of Rome. Augustus understood the necessity of maintaining the appearance of the republic, even as he consolidated power into his own hands. The Senate, once a powerful institution, was reduced to a ceremonial role, while the emperor became the supreme authority. Though Augustus implemented reforms that stabilized the empire, his reign marked the end of the republic and the beginning of autocratic rule. Augustus's reign, and the period that followed, was a time of peace and relative stability, often referred to as the Pax Romana. But beneath the surface, the empire's internal contradictions remained. The imperial system was built on the foundations of autocracy, and as emperors came and went, the stability of the empire depended largely on the strength and vision of individual rulers. The failure of succession systems, political instability, and factionalism began to plague the empire, leading to power struggles, assassination, and civil war. As the empire grew larger, these internal divisions only worsened. The 3rd century AD saw the empire experience a series of severe crises. The once unified empire fractured during the crisis of the 3rd century, when military usurpers and external enemies destabilized the empire. The Roman Empire was temporarily divided into 3 parts: the Gallic Empire, the Palmyrene Empire, and the Central Roman Empire. During this time, Rome was battered by constant civil war, invasions from barbarian tribes, and internal conflict. The empire's borders were increasingly threatened, and the political unity that had once been Rome's strength was shattered. Although the empire was briefly reunified under Emperor Aurelian, the damage had been done. The idea of Roman unity, which had been a defining characteristic of the empire, was now broken. The empire struggled to maintain cohesion, and the burdens of governance grew heavier. The internal disarray, compounded by external threats from the Goths, Vandals, and other barbarian tribes, was too much for the empire to overcome. The Roman military, which had once been invincible, was no longer the formidable force it had been in the past. Barbarian invasions, once repelled by Roman legions, were now overwhelming the empire's defences. Despite attempts to reform the empire, including efforts to restructure the military and administration, the internal and external challenges continued to mount. In 476 AD, the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the barbarian leader Odoacer, marking the official end of the Western Roman Empire. Yet, even in its final moments, the empire's legacy remained intact. The Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, would continue to carry the torch of Roman traditions for another 1,000 years, until its eventual fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Even though the Western Roman Empire fell, the ideas and institutions created by Rome continued to shape the development of Western civilization. The concepts of Roman law, governance, and citizenship endured, influencing the political systems and legal frameworks of future empires and republics. The Roman ideals of civic virtue, public duty, and the rule of law were passed down through generations, and the Renaissance saw a revival of Roman culture, art, and philosophy. The intellectual legacy of Rome shaped the minds of Renaissance thinkers and laid the groundwork for the modern Western world. Rome's fall, then, was not the end of its influence. The empire may have crumbled, but its ideas lived on in the Byzantine Empire, in medieval Europe, and in the institutions that arose in the wake of the Renaissance. Rome's legacy is not just one of territorial conquest, but of ideas that would continue to resonate throughout the centuries and shape the course of human history. Even as the empire itself faded into the past, the ideals it embodied, civic responsibility, the rule of law, and the pursuit of justice, remain as relevant today as they were in ancient Rome. In the end, the fall of the Roman Empire was not just a story of decline. It was a transformation, a shift that gave birth to new civilizations and new ideas. The Roman Empire may have fallen, but its legacy continues to influence the world we live in today. It is a testament to the enduring power of ideas, to the resilience of human culture, and to the lasting impact of a civilization that, even in its decline, shaped the future in profound ways. The fall of the Roman Empire was not the final chapter in the story of Rome's impact on the world. In fact, it marked the beginning of a new era, one that was heavily influenced by the ideas, institutions, and cultural legacies left behind by the empire. Rome's decline did not erase its existence. It transformed into something new, passing on its strength through the ages. The ideas that emerged from Rome's political systems, its legal structures, its philosophies, and its sense of civic duty would continue to reverberate across time, influencing societies for centuries after the empire had fallen. Perhaps one of the most significant contributions of the Roman Empire was the development of Roman law, a system of governance that has left a lasting imprint on modern legal systems. Roman law, particularly its principles of justice, the rights of citizens, and legal frameworks, became the foundation for many legal systems throughout Europe and the Western world. The concept of jus civile, or civil law, which emphasized the protection of individuals' rights within the state, was a radical departure from previous systems. It laid the groundwork for the rule of law as we understand it today, where laws apply equally to all citizens and the principles of justice and fairness are paramount. The idea that laws should be written down and accessible to all citizens was also a monumental shift. The codification of laws in the 12 Tables in ancient Rome set a precedent for transparency in governance, making the laws public and ensuring that no one, not even the ruler, was above the law. The Roman legal system also introduced the concept of legal professionals, lawyers, judges, and advocates who ensured that justice was not only administered fairly, but was also accessible to all. This development would go on to influence the structure of modern judicial systems, including the establishment of courts, the differentiation of criminal and civil law, and the establishment of legal precedents that continue to shape law today. Moreover, the Roman concept of citizenship was revolutionary. In the early years of the Republic, citizenship was a privilege granted only to a small, select group of people. However, as Rome expanded, the notion of citizenship evolved. The granting of Roman citizenship to conquered peoples, especially during the reign of Julius Caesar and later Augustus, was a significant moment in the evolution of the concept of citizenship as a universal right rather than an exclusive one. This extension of rights to more people became a model for the development of modern concepts of equality, democracy, and civic participation. As Rome's empire expanded, so too did its influence on governance. The Roman Republic, despite its flaws and eventual transition into an empire, introduced an early form of representative government that would later be adapted by other civilizations. The Roman Senate, which was the heart of the Republic's political structure, served as a model for future legislative bodies. The notion of balancing power through separate branches of government, a legislative body to make laws, an executive authority to enforce them, and a judiciary to interpret them, became the foundation of many modern political systems. It was in Rome that the idea of a mixed constitution, one that balanced the power between various classes and institutions, took shape. In the centuries following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, this Roman model of governance would influence the political structures of medieval Europe. The rise of the Holy Roman Empire in the Middle Ages although a far cry from the glory of ancient Rome, sought to resurrect some of the ideals and symbols of Roman governance. Charlemagne's coronation as the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in the 9th century, for example, was a direct attempt to revive the imperial legacy of Rome. Roman concepts of law, civic duty, and the idea of the emperor as a central political authority would live on in these medieval kingdoms. The Renaissance, which began in the 14th century, was another moment in history where Rome's influence re-emerged. The rediscovery of classical Roman texts, philosophies, and artistic principles sparked a cultural and intellectual revival that would change the course of European history. Renaissance scholars sought to reconnect with the ancient world, drawing heavily on Roman ideas of rationality, governance, civic virtue, and art. The Renaissance not only revived the study of Roman law and philosophy, but also saw the creation of art and architecture that drew directly from Roman styles, including the use of arches, columns, and domes that have since become iconic in Western architecture. The revival of classical learning and the application of Roman ideals to modern life was one of the driving forces behind the development of humanism, which emphasized the potential for human achievement in art, science, and philosophy. Roman influence also extended to the spread of Christianity. The early Christian Church, which began as a marginalized group in the Roman Empire, eventually became the dominant religious institution in Europe. Christianity's spread was facilitated by the infrastructure built by the Romans, the vast network of roads and communication systems that connected the empire. The Roman Empire, in its decline, also played a crucial role in the establishment of the Christian Church as a central institution in the Western world. Roman emperors, such as Constantine, famously embraced Christianity, making it the state religion of the empire. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Catholic Church inherited many of Rome's organizational structures, and the Bishop of Rome, who became the Pope, took on a leadership role that mirrored the imperial authority of the Roman emperors. Beyond politics and religion, Rome's intellectual legacy continued to shape Western thought. Roman philosophers, such as Cicero and Seneca, influenced the development of Stoicism, an ancient philosophy that emphasized self-control, virtue, and rationality. Stoic ideas became particularly influential in the development of ethical and moral thought in the Western world. The concept of natural law, which holds that certain rights and moral principles are inherent to human nature, can trace its roots back to Roman legal and philosophical traditions. Roman works in literature, history, and science, preserved and transmitted throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, continue to shape the intellectual development of the Western world. Though the Roman Empire eventually collapsed, its spirit lived on in the institutions, philosophies, and systems it helped to create. The empire's ultimate downfall, its inability to adapt to the pressures of expansion, political instability, and social decay, serves as a cautionary tale for modern civilizations. Yet even in its fall, Rome's enduring influence proves that the true power of a civilization lies not only in its physical conquest, but also in its ideas and its ability to shape the thinking of future generations. In the end, Rome's legacy is not defined by the end of its empire, but by its transformation. From the fall of the Western Roman Empire to the rise of the Byzantine Empire, from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, Rome's ideals continued to live on. Its concepts of law, citizenship, governance, and civic duty formed the bedrock of modern Western civilization. Rome's collapse may have closed one chapter, but it also laid the foundation for new beginnings, new ideas, and the emergence of the modern world. The legacy of Rome lives on, and in every form of government, every legal system, every piece of art, and every philosophical thought that values reason and justice, one can trace the indelible mark of the Roman Empire. The fall of the Roman Empire is often depicted as the closing of a monumental chapter in history, one that left behind a civilization that had dominated the known world for centuries. Yet, as much as the decline of the empire marks the end of an era, it simultaneously signals the beginning of another, a period in which Rome's intellectual and cultural influence would continue to shape the world long after the empire had crumbled. Rome's enduring legacy is not just a reflection of its imperial might, but also a testament to its ability to adapt, to influence, and to leave behind a lasting imprint on civilization itself. At its height, the Roman Empire was a testament to human achievement. Its military power was unmatched, its legal system groundbreaking, and its infrastructure unparalleled. However, the internal conflicts and external pressures that led to the empire's fragmentation also catalyzed the development of new political, social, and cultural systems. In this sense, Rome's fall was not a simple demise, but a transition, a moment in history when the world shifted, propelled forward by the very ideas and structures that Rome had laid down. One of the most profound aspects of Rome's legacy is its contribution to the development of governance. At the core of Roman society was the concept of the res publica, the idea of a shared responsibility for governance. The Roman Republic, though flawed, laid the groundwork for many modern democratic systems. The principles of separation of powers, checks and balances, and the role of citizenship were enshrined in Roman political thought. These ideas were not static but evolved, and even in the face of its transformation into an empire, Rome's political ideas continued to influence generations. The rise of autocracy under the emperors did not erase the underlying Roman belief in civic duty. Even as emperors like Augustus consolidated power, they maintained the illusion of republican institutions. The Senate continued to meet, and public discourse remained a central part of Roman political life. However, the nature of power had shifted. Rome's embrace of imperial rule did not mark a complete abandonment of republican ideals, but rather a reconfiguration. Augustus understood that in order for Rome to survive, it needed stability, and this required centralizing authority. The legacy of this approach can be seen in the balance of power found in modern states, where central authority is often countered by democratic checks and balances. Yet, despite the imperial nature of Rome, its political legacy continued to influence the development of political systems throughout history. The Roman concept of citizenship, once an exclusive right granted to a select few, gradually evolved into a broader, more inclusive idea. Citizenship was extended to more people and eventually to all free inhabitants of the empire. This notion of universal rights would become one of the cornerstones of modern political thought, influencing the development of modern concepts of citizenship, equality, and rights. Equally important was the Roman contribution to the rule of law. The Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled under the direction of Emperor Justinian in the 6th century AD, codified Roman law and preserved it for future generations. The principles of Roman law, such as the presumption of innocence, the importance of due process, and the protection of private property, became the foundation for many legal systems around the world. Even as the Western Roman Empire fell, the legacy of Roman law endured, informing the legal systems of medieval Europe and beyond. The concept of justice in Rome was far more than an abstract ideal. It was a practical system designed to regulate society. Roman courts were established to resolve disputes, and Roman citizens had access to legal protections that were unheard of in many other parts of the world. The idea that law should be accessible to all, not just the elite, was revolutionary. The Romans also pioneered the concept of legal professionals, lawyers, and judges, who were tasked with ensuring that justice was administered fairly and impartially. These innovations laid the foundation for the modern legal systems we take for granted today. However, Rome's impact was not confined to governance and law alone. Its cultural and intellectual contributions were equally monumental. The Roman Empire was the bridge between the classical world of Greece and the medieval world that would follow. While the Greeks had established the foundations of philosophy, science, and art, it was the Romans who spread these ideas across a vast empire, ensuring that the intellectual achievements of the Greeks were preserved and transmitted to future generations. Roman scholars and philosophers, such as Cicero, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, not only kept Greek thought alive, but also contributed their own ideas, which would go on to shape the intellectual movements of the Renaissance and beyond. Roman art and architecture also left an indelible mark on the world. The Romans mastered the art of engineering, creating innovations such as aqueducts, bridges, and roads that have influenced architecture and infrastructure for centuries. The Roman arch, the dome, and the use of concrete were revolutionary building techniques that enabled the construction of monumental structures like the Colosseum, the Pantheon, and the Roman bath structures that continue to inspire architects and engineers today. Even in the decay of the empire, these physical remnants stood as a testament to Roman ingenuity. The legacy of Roman art and architecture also permeated the Renaissance, a period that saw a resurgence of interest in classical ideals. During this time, artists, architects, and scholars rediscovered and built upon Roman designs and techniques. The Dome of St. Peter's Basilica, designed by Michelangelo, and the neoclassical buildings that dotted the European landscape all pay homage to the architectural principles developed by the Romans. This blending of ancient Roman ideas with Renaissance creativity laid the groundwork for modern Western architecture. Furthermore, the Roman Empire's influence extended beyond Europe. The Romans established colonies and trading posts throughout Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Through their vast network of roads and trade routes, the Romans facilitated the exchange of ideas, goods, and culture across continents. The Roman presence in regions like North Africa and the Middle East left a lasting cultural and architectural imprint. In the wake of the Roman Empire's collapse, the Byzantine Empire, its eastern half, continued to carry the torch of Roman culture, law, and governance for another 1,000 years. The Byzantines saw themselves as Romans, preserving the language, traditions, and values of their predecessors. This continuity ensured that the legacy of Rome remained intact, influencing the course of European and Middle Eastern history long after the fall of Constantinople. In the centuries following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the influence of Rome's ideas did not fade. The Catholic Church, which became the dominant religious institution in Europe, inherited many of Rome's organizational structures. The Pope, as the Bishop of Rome, became the spiritual leader of Christendom, and the Church adopted many Roman administrative practices, from the use of Latin as the language of scholarship to the organizational structure of the clergy. The Roman ideal of civic duty, of serving the common good, was reflected in the Church's charitable works and its role in governance. Even as the empire itself crumbled, the ideals of Rome continued to shape European thought, law, and governance. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the rise of modern democracy can all trace their intellectual roots back to the Roman tradition. The idea of a republic, of representative government, and of the rule of law all had their origins in Roman thought. The Roman Empire's fall may have signaled the end of an era, but its influence endured. Rome's legacy also found expression in the political structures of the United States. The founding fathers of America, deeply influenced by Roman republicanism, created a government based on the principles of checks and balances, separation of powers, and the importance of civic virtue. The United States Constitution, with its emphasis on individual rights and the rule of law, was influenced by the ideals of Roman law and governance. In many ways, the story of Rome is the story of civilization itself, the story of how a small city on the banks of the Tiber grew into a world-spanning empire that forever changed the course of history. Rome's rise and fall demonstrate the power of ideas and institutions to shape the world long after their physical structures have fallen. The Roman Empire may have crumbled, but its legacy continues to resonate, proving that empires may fall, but ideas endure. The Roman Empire's profound influence did not end with the fall of its Western counterpart. The ideological and cultural contributions it made continue to shape the world in ways that extend far beyond its imperial borders. Even as the empire fractured and disintegrated under the weight of internal division and external threats, the ideas, values, and systems that emerged from Roman civilization persisted, adapted, and thrived in new forms. Rome's lasting legacy, therefore, is not found solely in the monuments or artifacts left behind, but in the intellectual, political, and cultural foundations that continue to define much of the modern world. Perhaps one of the most enduring elements of Roman culture is its intellectual contributions. While it was the Greeks who pioneered much of Western philosophy, it was the Romans who synthesized and transmitted these ideas to later generations. In particular, Roman legal thinkers and statesmen played an instrumental role in preserving and refining ideas about law, governance, and civic responsibility. The works of Roman philosophers such as Cicero, Seneca, and Epictetus continued to inform philosophical thought long after the empire's fall. These thinkers explored issues of ethics, virtue, and the role of the individual in society. themes that resonated through the Renaissance and into the modern era. Roman philosophy's emphasis on Stoicism, for example, had a profound influence on Christian thought and later Enlightenment ideals. The Stoic virtues of self-discipline, rationality, and endurance in the face of hardship became central to Western ideals of personal responsibility and resilience. It was through the preservation of such Roman philosophical traditions that later thinkers like Marcus Aurelius, the last of the five good emperors, became a symbol of wisdom and moral leadership. His work, Meditations, still serves as an influential text on self-reflection and leadership, demonstrating the continuity of Roman thought long after the empire itself faded into history. The Roman legacy is also deeply embedded in the way modern societies understand the rule of law and justice. Roman law, with its emphasis on fairness, individual rights, and the concept of due process, laid the foundation for much of the legal framework that underpins modern judicial systems. The notion that law is not the will of the ruler, but a system that applies equally to all citizens, is a fundamental concept that has endured for centuries. From the principles enshrined in the 12 Tables to the codification of law under Emperor Justinian, Roman legal thought set the stage for the development of legal codes in Europe and beyond. Even the United States, with its legal system built on English common law, found inspiration in Roman precedents. Roman concepts of citizenship, too, have had a lasting impact on political theory and practice. The expansion of Roman citizenship, initially granted to a select few, became more inclusive over time, serving as an early model of how a diverse and expansive society could build a cohesive identity. The Roman understanding of citizenship emphasized participation in civic life, including voting, holding office, and serving in the military. This idea of active, engaged citizenship continues to be a cornerstone of modern democratic systems. The idea that every individual should have a voice in the governance of their society, that power derives from the people, was central to the development of modern representative democracies. Furthermore, the Roman Empire's vast infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, and cities has had a lasting influence on how societies organize themselves. The Romans were master builders, creating structures that not only served their immediate needs, but also left a lasting legacy in the form of engineering principles still used today. Roman roads, which connected the empire from Britain to Mesopotamia, laid the groundwork for the transportation systems that would shape European and eventually global trade. These roads facilitated not just the movement of armies and goods, but the exchange of ideas and culture, contributing to the spread of Roman influence far beyond its military conquests. The aqueducts, another Roman engineering marvel, have been foundational in the development of modern urban infrastructure. They provided cities with fresh water, a necessity that underpinned the growth of urban centres and allowed for the flourishing of Roman society. This innovation in public works has influenced modern water management systems and urban planning, with engineers continuing to learn from the principles developed by the Romans. Moreover, Roman architecture and design have left an indelible mark on the physical landscapes of the modern world. The grandeur of Roman structures like the Pantheon, with its sweeping dome, and the Colosseum, an arena for public spectacle, inspired Renaissance architects and continues to influence the design of modern public spaces. The concept of monumental architecture, built to awe and inspire, became a key feature of both Renaissance and neoclassical architecture, and remains a model for structures of civic importance today. Government buildings, monuments, and museums around the world draw upon Roman architectural principles in their design, ensuring that the visual language of Roman power and grandeur endures. Culturally, the Roman Empire's influence on the development of art and literature cannot be overstated. Roman culture absorbed the artistic traditions of Greece, and in turn passed these on to the medieval world. Roman poets such as Virgil, Horace, and Ovid wrote works that not only celebrated the greatness of Rome, but also explored themes of love, loss, and fate, universal themes that continue to resonate in literature to this day. The themes and narratives found in Roman literature formed the basis for much of Western storytelling, influencing writers from the medieval period all the way through to contemporary novelists and playwrights. Even the language of Rome, Latin, has had a profound and lasting influence. Though Latin is no longer spoken as a vernacular language, it remains the foundation for the Romance languages Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. Latin also continues to be used in scientific, legal, and religious contexts, ensuring its place in modern discourse. The preservation and study of Latin texts have also been instrumental in the development of Western education, providing scholars with the intellectual tools to explore everything from theology to the natural sciences. Perhaps most importantly, the idea of the Roman Empire and its cultural legacy continued to serve as a symbol for later empires. The Byzantine Empire, which carried the torch of Roman governance and culture for over 1,000 years, saw itself as the legitimate heir of Rome. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, the concept of Rome's greatness did not vanish. The Renaissance, which saw a revival of interest in classical antiquity, drew heavily on Roman thought, art, and literature. This revival helped shape the intellectual and cultural currents of the modern age, sparking new ideas about politics, art, science, and philosophy. In many ways, the United States, founded on the principles of republicanism and democracy, can trace its intellectual roots back to Roman republicanism. The founding fathers of the United States were deeply influenced by Roman ideas, drawing upon them to construct a new government that balanced power and protected individual liberties. The ideals of the Roman Republic government by consent of the governed, the importance of civic virtue, and the need for a system of checks and balances became guiding principles for the formation of the U.S. Constitution. In conclusion, the fall of the Roman Empire does not mark the end of its influence. Rather, it marks the beginning of a new chapter. Rome's ideas, its culture, and its legacy continue to shape the modern world in ways that are felt daily. From our political systems to our legal codes, from our infrastructure to our cultural institutions, Rome's imprint is indelible. The Roman Empire may have fallen, but its influence lives on, shaping the present and influencing the future. The fall of the Roman Empire is often marked as one of the greatest shifts in human history, but the truth is far more complex. It is not simply the end of an empire, but the culmination of a long process of transformation, internal conflicts, and external pressures that stretched over centuries. The empire's eventual collapse was not a singular event, but a slow unraveling of an institution that had, at its peak, dominated the known world. Yet, as the walls of this once mighty empire crumbled, its spirit, ideas, and influence lived on in ways that no one could have foreseen. The fall of Rome was not the disappearance of Roman culture, but the start of its legacy's continued impact on the world. As we look at the fall of Rome, we must also understand the incredible achievements that led to its rise and the profound questions it posed about human governance, power, and resilience. Rome's story was one of triumph, ambition, and power, but it was also a cautionary tale of how even the greatest civilizations must confront their own limitations. The empire's rise, which had been propelled by military conquests, civic unity, and the strength of Roman law, ultimately faced the limitations of its own success. The more the empire grew, the harder it became to manage. Its political and military systems, once the backbone of Roman power, became overstretched and increasingly corrupt. The grand institutions that had once inspired awe across the empire began to falter under the weight of their own complexity. But to understand the true nature of Rome's fall, we must examine how Rome, despite its imperfections, laid the groundwork for modern civilization. Its political system, while never perfect, provided the foundation for ideas of governance that continue to shape the world today. The Republic, with its concept of shared power, checks and balances, and the role of law in civil society, provided the philosophical bedrock for the rise of modern democracy. Even as Rome transitioned into an empire, its legacy as a republic remained foundational, influencing future political systems, including that of the United States, which would later adopt Roman ideas about government. Similarly, the Roman military system, once the pride of the empire, became both a strength and a weakness. The Roman legions were renowned for their discipline, their innovation in warfare, and their loyalty to the empire. However, as the empire expanded, the loyalty of these legions became more fractured. The reliance on mercenaries, many of whom came from the very barbarian tribes that Rome once fought against, began to erode the cohesiveness and effectiveness of the Roman military. The breakdown in military discipline was a reflection of deeper political divisions within the empire. These fissures in the Roman military eventually contributed to its vulnerability. The pressures of defending such vast borders, coupled with internal instability, meant that Rome could no longer maintain the unity that had once made it the most powerful force in the ancient world. What's perhaps most striking about the fall of the Roman Empire is how much of its legacy endured despite the collapse. Rome's ideas about law, governance, and citizenship lived on, not just in the medieval world but in the modern era as well. Roman law, particularly the concept of natural law and the idea of rights as being inherent to human beings, had a profound influence on the development of legal systems in Europe and later the Americas. The Roman concept of civitas, or citizenship, gradually evolved, becoming more inclusive and eventually forming the basis of modern understandings of civil rights and responsibilities. Even as the empire faded, these ideas persisted, and they were absorbed into the cultures that followed, from the Byzantine Empire to the feudal systems of medieval Europe and into the very core of the Enlightenment period. Moreover, Roman architectural and engineering feats continued to inspire civilizations long after the empire's fall. The Roman roads, aqueducts, and monumental structures like the Colosseum and the Pantheon set the standard for future generations of engineers, architects, and city planners. Even though the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, the Roman model for infrastructure lived on. The development of roads for military and civilian use became the blueprint for the roads of Europe and beyond. Roman engineering, especially their use of arches and concrete, laid the foundations for the Renaissance, which saw a revival of classical Roman principles. The architects of the Renaissance were inspired by Roman ingenuity, and we can still see the influence of Roman design in the architecture of Western cities today. The fall of Rome also marked a shift in the cultural and intellectual landscape. While the Western Empire crumbled under the weight of external pressures and internal strife, the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire, carried on much of Rome's intellectual and cultural heritage for another 1,000 years. The Byzantine Empire preserved Roman law, literature, and traditions, and it was here that many of Rome's greatest works were studied, copied, and kept alive. As the West entered the so-called Dark Ages, the Byzantine Empire kept the flame of Roman civilization burning, ensuring that the ideas of ancient Rome would eventually be passed down to future generations. In the West, even as political power was in disarray, Rome's cultural and intellectual influence persisted through the medieval Church. The Catholic Church, which had been both an ally and an adversary of the empire at different points, became the most important institution in Western Europe. The Church inherited many Roman administrative structures, including the use of Latin, which remained the language of scholarship, governance, and religion for centuries. The Church became the caretaker of Roman traditions, preserving the ideas of Roman governance and law as it exerted control over much of medieval Europe. As the Renaissance unfolded, the intellectual climate shifted back toward the study of ancient Roman texts. Humanist scholars, such as Petrarch and Erasmus, rediscovered Roman works and sought to revive the classical ideals of humanism, which had flourished in the Roman Republic. This rebirth of classical learning would influence the development of modern Western thought, particularly in the fields of science, philosophy, and politics. The ideals of individualism, civic duty, and rational inquiry that were central to Roman thought became central to the intellectual movements of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. The influence of Rome also spread across the Atlantic, where the founding fathers of the United States, deeply inspired by Roman republicanism, established a government based on the principles of checks and balances, civic virtue, and the rule of law. The concept of the Republic as a system of government, where power is vested in the people and their elected representatives, was a direct inheritance from Rome. The political institutions of the United States, from the separation of powers to the protection of individual rights, were built upon Roman ideas about governance, justice, and the role of the citizen in public life. In this way, the fall of the Roman Empire did not signify the end of its influence, but rather the beginning of a new chapter in history, where its ideas, principles, and culture would continue to shape the development of Western civilization. The fall of Rome was not the end of the Roman idea, but the transformation of it. Even as the empire crumbled and its borders were overrun by barbarians, the intellectual and cultural legacy of Rome endured. It lived on in the Byzantine Empire, in the Catholic Church, in the Renaissance, in the Enlightenment, and in the formation of modern democratic governments. The fall of the Roman Empire, then, should not be seen as a tragic end, but as a pivotal moment in history, a transition that paved the way for the emergence of new civilizations and new ideas. Rome may have fallen, but its spirit, its influence, and its legacy endure to this day. The empire may have crumbled, but the ideas it embodied, ideas of citizenship, law, and governance live on, shaping the course of human history in ways that Rome's founders could never have imagined. The fall of the Roman Empire marks a significant turning point in history, yet it also represents the enduring nature of the empire's ideas, culture, and legacy. The collapse was not the tragic demise of a civilization, but rather the beginning of a new era where the ideas and structures that Rome had developed continued to resonate across time. Despite the physical fall of the empire, Rome's principles of governance, law, and citizenship persisted, influencing future generations, civilizations, and modern societies. It was the internal and external challenges that led to Rome's fragmentation, but in the wake of these challenges, new structures emerged, carrying forward Rome's foundational ideas. One of the most profound impacts of the fall of Rome was the transformation in how people thought about political power and governance. The Roman Empire, with its intricate political systems, had created a model of government that was remarkably effective at managing vast territories. Despite the eventual failure of this system to handle the growing complexities of an empire of its size, its core principles continued to serve as a foundation for many governments that would follow. The separation of powers, the importance of civic participation, and the rule of law were all concepts that had their roots in Roman governance. These principles not only survived the fall of the empire, but were refined and adapted by later civilizations, notably influencing the formation of modern Western political thought. The transition from Roman republicanism to empire marked a dramatic shift in the concentration of power. While Rome was initially a republic where power was shared and checked by a senate, the eventual rise of autocratic rule under the emperors indicated a different model of governance. Augustus, though technically a monarch, cleverly maintained the outward appearance of republican institutions, preserving a semblance of shared governance. This blending of autocracy and republican ideals left a lasting mark on later political systems, especially in the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches of government. The emergence of centralized power in Rome, under the guise of republican forms, would eventually inspire the structure of modern republics, particularly in the United States, where similar ideals were incorporated into the Constitution. Rome's legal legacy also continues to resonate through time. The Roman legal system, particularly its codification of law, became the bedrock for many modern legal frameworks. The compilation of laws under Roman law, particularly through works such as the Corpus Juris Civilis under Emperor Justinian, ensured that Roman legal thought would remain relevant for centuries. Concepts such as the presumption of innocence, due process, and the protection of property rights have been absorbed into modern legal systems worldwide. Even as the empire itself faded into the background, Roman law continued to shape legal discourse, with its principles embedded in the legal traditions of both European nations and the United States. The Roman Empire's contribution to the development of infrastructure and urban planning cannot be overstated. Roman engineering, from their vast network of roads to their aqueducts and bridges, laid the foundation for the infrastructure of Europe and beyond. The Roman emphasis on urbanization, particularly in terms of their advanced city planning, set a precedent for future civilizations. Roman roads became the arteries of Europe, facilitating trade, communication, and military movement long after the fall of the empire. Even as the Western Roman Empire disintegrated, the infrastructure it left behind provided the groundwork for the medieval period and the eventual rebirth of European civilization during the Renaissance. Roman architecture, too, had a lasting impact on later societies. The use of arches, vaults, and concrete allowed the Romans to construct monumental structures that stood the test of time. The Colosseum, the Pantheon, and countless Roman baths are just a few examples of Roman ingenuity that continued to influence architectural styles for centuries. During the Renaissance, Roman architectural principles were rediscovered and adapted by artists and engineers, most notably in the works of Michelangelo and Brunelleschi. The iconic domes and arches seen in Renaissance architecture are direct descendants of Roman design, and these same techniques have shaped the skylines of modern cities around the world. The fall of the Roman Empire, however, did not lead to a sudden end of Roman culture. Instead, it was the beginning of a transformation in which Roman thought and traditions were adapted, preserved, and passed on through the Byzantine Empire, the Catholic Church, and eventually the intellectual movements of the Renaissance. The Byzantine Empire, which carried on much of the Roman tradition, ensured the survival of Roman ideas, especially in law and governance. Byzantine scholars preserved Roman texts and legal systems, ensuring that the wisdom of ancient Rome would not be lost to history. Even as the Western Roman Empire succumbed to invasions, the Eastern Roman Empire continued to maintain Roman culture, law, and governance for nearly another 1,000 years. The Catholic Church also played a pivotal role in preserving Roman culture after the empire's collapse. The Church, particularly in Western Europe, inherited Roman administrative structures, including the use of Latin and the concept of a centralized hierarchical organization. The Church became the most significant institution in medieval Europe, and its structure mirrored many of the Roman systems it had inherited. The Roman emphasis on civic duty and service to the common good was reflected in the Church's charitable works and its governance over Christian Europe. Moreover, the cultural revival of Roman ideals during the Renaissance marked a significant reawakening of classical learning. Humanist scholars, inspired by Roman thinkers like Cicero, Seneca, and Virgil, sought to recover and revive the intellectual achievements of ancient Rome. These scholars studied Roman texts, philosophies, and histories, believing that the classical age of Rome had reached the height of human intellectual achievement. The Renaissance's rediscovery of Roman thought laid the groundwork for the Enlightenment, a period that would produce revolutionary ideas about democracy, human rights, and reason, all of which have their roots in Roman republicanism and law. The Renaissance also saw the re-emergence of Roman architectural forms, including the dome, the arch, and the column. These elements, which had been perfected by Roman engineers and architects, were embraced once again by Renaissance artists and architects. The most iconic example of this is Michelangelo's design of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, which incorporated Roman principles of symmetry and grandeur. These architectural elements have continued to influence architecture throughout history, from neoclassical buildings in the 18th century to the modern-day use of Roman-inspired designs in public buildings, libraries, and museums. Finally, the political and cultural influence of Rome continued to resonate across the Atlantic in the creation of the United States. The founding fathers of the U.S., particularly Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, drew heavily on Roman Republican ideals when designing the American government. The concept of a mixed constitution, with a balance between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, was directly inspired by the Roman model of governance. The American emphasis on civic virtue, the protection of individual rights, and the rule of law all had their roots in Roman thought and law. In conclusion, while the fall of the Roman Empire marked the end of an era, it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in world history. The ideals of Rome, the concepts of citizenship, law, civic duty, and governance continued to shape the course of civilization long after the empire's decline. Rome's legacy lives on not just in the ruins of its empire, but in the institutions, ideas, and cultures that grew from it. From the Byzantine Empire to the Renaissance, and from the Enlightenment to the foundations of modern democratic governments, the fall of Rome was not the end of its influence, but the continuation of its transformative impact on the world. The empire may have crumbled, but the ideas it embodied continue to resonate, shaping our political systems, legal frameworks, and cultural values today.